Lulu Meservey, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
So I've been following you for a long time online, and you're really interesting in having understood earlier than most that the old-fashioned communications playbook doesn't work anymore because the old-fashioned structure of media doesn't exist anymore. Perhaps let's take a step back. What would somebody who is at the top of the comms game have suggested 25, 20 years ago to a company when they're launching a big new product or when they're dealing with a critical media story? What would the advice have been about what they should do under those circumstances?
Back then, communications was very centralized. You hear people reminiscing about there were three TV channels, and that was more than 25 years ago. But still, there were many fewer TV channels, many fewer online channels. YouTube was not what it was. Twitter is not what it is, and so you had to go to the gatekeepers. And the game is if you can win over the gatekeepers who have the audiences, then you can essentially borrow their audience for a moment while they tell their audience something good about you because they have the people, they have the following, and they have the trust. And so the game is to find the 10 people there, win them over, and then they basically vouch for you to the audience. And then there was
So,
this.
so, so you lunch and dine the beat reporter, the New York Times columnist, sort of all of those traditional journalists, and you hope that they're going to tell your story for you.
Yes, and today even when you talk to people who are sort of eminence grise, I say this in a respectful way, in the PR world, who know everybody, I've been doing this for a long time, their go-to move is still to go wine and dine the editors or to put you in front of an editorial board. I learned about this thing called desk sides, which is, I guess it originates from you just popping up on the side of someone's desk and trying to become friends with them. But apparently go
How
to
do you do that?
you have your handler take you around and essentially meet with all of these people and try to earn their favor.
Interesting.
Yeah.
And so that was effective in a different kind of media landscape. Why do you think that that isn't effective anymore? That if you're trying to launch a product, you're trying to get your startup better known, you're trying to get word out there, it still feels like it would be pretty useful to have, a favorable mention of your product or of your company in the New York Times. Surely that still makes a difference. Why is that no longer, by and large, the kind of game you should play?
Yeah. Well, first of all, doing that is a nice to have. Having people on your side is always better than not, and having friends is always better than not. I am not one of these people who says that the New York Times is completely irrelevant. No, there's some relevance, and especially with specific audiences. If you're selling to government or if you're about to IPO, there certainly is relevance. So it is a nice to have. You don't have to burn those boats in order to go do something else. However, the something else that we're about to talk to is a lot more effective. That something else is now decentralized, going from you to many. Now, there are still people in your audience who are more influential than others. There are people who are literal influencers or creators or whose voices just carry a lot of weight, but there are still very, very many of them compared to 25 years ago or a decade ago. So it's more decentralized. You're going one to many. It's much more dependent on trust and credibility than it was before, because it's not just you win over one person and they trust you and then they vouch for you. This is, you have to be earning that trust over and over with so many people in so many quarters constantly. And then lastly, what's emerging is there's this glut of AI slop, and it's coming from people, and it's also coming from companies. And you see companies put things out there that are indistinguishable from like Chat GPT when it was GPT 3.5. And that just doesn't cut it anymore. So the bar for cutting through and the bar for quality is a lot higher. So on the topic of many to many, by the way, here's an important caveat, which is, or it's a note, which is that it's no longer just one person speaking on behalf of the entire enterprise. It's not just the CEO speaking on behalf of the company or just the candidate speaking on behalf of the campaign. Now you have employees weighing in, or employees of the campaign, or people who belong to that political movement weighing in. And so it truly is many, many, many to many, where sometimes the voices of employees are actually more important than what the CEO is saying. So, for example, you have employees speaking out about workplace conditions or about doubts over the company, or disgruntled employees who leave. what they're saying can actually make much more of an impact than a press release or an announcement from the company. And so if you're the CEO of the company, you need to know that you have tens or hundreds of minor spokespeople, or not even minor, like alternate spokespeople working in your company, and they need to all be aligned. It's not something where you just speak for everybody and they all stay silent.
Yeah, I'm thinking of this book that Clay Shirky wrote a long time ago, where he distinguished between a world of one to many communication and the world we're now in of many to many communication. So,
Yeah.
in the old world, there just weren't a lot of people around who could reach a large audience. And so, if you wanted to reach a large audience, you basically were dependent on those desk sides or on those lunches or on those dinners, because the number of people who could say, hey, there's this amazing new tech product, were, the tech editor of the New York Times, and of Wired, and, perhaps of 60 Minutes or something like that. And unless you were able to get one of them to tell your story, you would have had to rely basically on word of mouth. Now, for some kinds of products, word of mouth might work, right? They are so addictive, they are so convincing that you just give it in the hands of 100 people, and like a virus, it spreads to lots and lots of people. But that's going to be a relatively limited number of products that has those properties. And I guess now we're in a world of many to many communication, where the set of people who can reach a wide audience is hugely expanded, both because a lot of people have significant social media followings, and that if you can create content on social media that is sufficiently viral that it ends up taking off, then all of a word of mouth can happen on the social media platforms. It doesn't have to be in-person word of mouth. And so that just creates these new kind of avenues of communication.
Yeah, I think the lazy way to approach this is to say, it doesn't matter too much how interesting we are. If we can just get in front of people, we will force them to see us. They read the Wall Street Journal, and we will get in the Wall Street Journal somehow through these relationships, and then we will non-consensually force our news into their eyeballs, and they're going to like it. That this is a caricature, but that's the extreme version of laziness, where you're not trying to be particularly interesting. You're just like, we've got news, we're going to force it into your feed, or into your paper. The other way to do this, which I think is much better, is it's harder. You have to challenge yourself to be so fascinating and for your news to be so arresting that you could whisper it to 10 people and they couldn't help but each tell 10 other people, and those people can't help but tell 10 other people. And so if you put in the extra work up front, you're basically putting a multiplier, or you're putting leverage behind the message. And mathematically, if each person wants to tell a bunch of other people, you're much better off, for obvious reasons, than for you, for you to tell 5 people and then have them each want to tell a bunch of people, is much better than you telling 1,000 people up front and then call it a day, because it's so boring that they're not going to talk about it anymore.
Yeah, I think that people always underestimate the importance of having the right viral message and overestimate the importance of doing it in the right way and perhaps even having the right advice. I mean, I'm thinking about times when I've published books, and I've heard, this from friends as well, where if you're publishing a book that, for whatever reason, speaks to that moment, right, that has a message that people want to be hearing, and most of the time when your book is really successful, it's because it has a message that people already want to be hearing, which is a little depressing. Then you're going to end up thinking that your PR person, usually it's a marketing professional at your publisher, perhaps sometimes you've hired one yourself, is really amazing because they're booking you on all these great shows, and
Yeah.
they're making all of these things happen for you, right?
Right.
And if you have a book that might be a good book, might be a more interesting book, but that doesn't have that product market fit, that doesn't really fit into that moment, what people want to be hearing or what producers want to be hearing from, you're going to start getting frustrated with your PR professional, with your marketing person, saying, oh, the last one was much better, they could get me on whatever show, and this person is not getting me on that show, and they must have worse contacts, or they must not be putting as much work in. But most likely, I mean, obviously there are differences between very good people and less good people, but most likely it's not actually the difference in that person. Sometimes it's the same damn person doing the same damn thing.
Yeah.
It's the difference in what you're selling and whether your message happens to have demand at that time or not.
Yeah, I would say the person reaching out or the medium, or the shows that you choose or the tweets that you write, these things matter. They're not nothing, but their importance pales, really, really pales in comparison to how interesting the message actually is. People do not think enough about making themselves interesting and relevant to other people. The challenge would be, can you describe this in a way that someone who hears this is going to tell their family about it over dinner? And they're going to know how to describe it and they're going to want to bring it up. And if not, you failed the test. Like if nobody wants to pass it on, if they don't know how to talk about it, you failed the test. You reach however many people you reach with the first volley. You force yourself into their feed. They have to listen to it. Maybe you trick them into listening to it because they're scrolling past it. And then there's just no legs after that. So I think that's true laziness if you're focusing on the medium of like, how do I get on the show? And then you're on the show and then you say something that is so bland and insignificant that nobody wants to ever revisit it ever again. So same with books, same with ideas, companies, product launches, you name it.
What about because you're talking about the message once you're on the show? I find that the few times that I've had media training, it's not clear to me that it gave the right advice. Because basically, what it said was you go into the show and you have the 3 points that you want to make. And whatever happens, you bring those points in. And you're really extremely disciplined about bringing in those points. And you have this battle plan for the conversation,
Yeah.
the purpose of which is to get those talking points out.
Yeah.
And I think perhaps it depends a little bit on what you're trying to do, right? I mean, if you're launching a product, I can understand how, you gotta save a day in which it goes on sale, whatever happens, right? Or there's like one particular selling point of this product, you gotta make sure that it somehow comes up. For my purposes, where, I want to sell a book or I want people to, become paying subscribers of my Substack, yaschamonk.substack.com, if you still haven't, dear listener, even though I keep saying it every damn episode. Sure, I can see that, but I find that if I'm too focused on getting across the points that I want to make, I become inauthentic. I become kind of weird, right? Like it can be jarring because even if you're doing it relatively elegantly and subtly, people can smell that you're just trying to bring the conversation back to the thing you're trying to do. And probably the person I'm having a conversation with is thinking, oh, this guest isn't great because they're not actually answering my questions. They're just going back to their talking point. So do you think that that is one of the pieces of conventional wisdom that people should question?
I,
Yeah, I think it's Lulu. I can go on mute for a second.
I think it's you, Yasha.
Yeah, it seems to have been.
But now it's gone.
Yeah, now it's just gone.
No, now it's back.
That's weird. And we've never had it when I've been recording, but perhaps there's something going on here. I
Now
think
it's
we'll just. Yeah, you can't hear anything, Lulu, right? There's not like air conditioning or.
no, for a moment there was like a like a white
Yeah,
noise,
exactly.
but now it's totally gone.
It is totally gone. Well, we'll jump back in and just send us the backup recording as well. Perhaps that way we have two sources of
Yes,
audio.
we'll
But I think it
do.
should be fine.
Yeah, we'll do. Um,
All right. So should people stick to their talking points, or should they be more authentic?
Most people are excessively media trained. And what's happening is not that you're training sophistication into the person, it's actually that you're training personality out of them and you're training the edge out of them. And so I'm a big believer in not excessively media training somebody because the vibes of the person are much more important than the specific words that they say. People
Hmm.
are left with an impression of you as a person, and that impression is, well, according to some studies, over 90% based on your vibes, your aura, your body language, your tone of voice, your appearance, rather than the actual words that you say. And so if you have to make that trade off of, am I going to sacrifice some of my vibes and personality and sparkle in order to say the right words, that's a horrible trade off. Now, there's probably 50 people alive who don't have to make that trade off. Maybe there's 50 people in America who don't have to make that trade-off. If you're Bill Clinton or Barack Obama, maybe if you're Donald Trump, I don't know. If you're Pete Buttigieg, these people who have extreme talent for weaving talking points in while making it seem pretty natural, then great. It's not a trade-off. You can do both. But for the vast majority of people, there is some trade-off there. So you'd have to be very, very careful how much of that you trade. And the other thing to remember is, for most cases, the product is the person. So if you're trying to promote your book or your Substack, the product is actually you. It's not the one specific book or the one specific piece of writing. It is your thoughts and you as a person. So, for example, Barry Weiss and the Free Press and now going to CBS, the predominant source of trust or credibility around the Free Press was whether you liked or trusted Barry, right? She as a person represented the product. I don't know anyone who hates Barry Weiss. There's a lot of people who hate Barry Weiss, but I don't know anybody who hate her but love the Free Press. And
Right.
so you represent the product, you represent the company, and if you show up as some clunky, inauthentic poser, then that casts a pall over the whole company. So one of my favorite people in tech, Scott Wu, who is the leader of a company called Cognition, which creates a coding agent, and he is somebody who is most comfortable just in front of a computer and not trying to hold forth. But he has gone on podcasts because he wants to tell people about their product, Devin. And the feedback that I've gotten is the best podcast he ever did was one where he was severely sleep deprived and truly and sort of undisciplined in a way. You know, just a little bit like impatient and very raw. And people loved it because it was the closest that they got to the real Scott. That when you
Right, right.
he's a great hang, but then when he's in front of a camera, he's usually a little bit uncomfortable.
So this is the advice that I got before I did my first ever television interview, which was a CNN interview about doping of all things.
Nice.
And what somebody told me is, if you want to be good on TV, you just have to be yourself, which sounds similar to what you're saying. Of course, the ironic thing is that that's the thing that it's impossible to do when you're starting to do TV. I think by now I can more or less do it. I've done enough broadcasting, the podcast, and media appearances and so on. But I'm not fully myself, but I'm close to being myself. But that takes a lot of practice. That takes a lot of hours because it's a very unnatural situation to be in a room with somebody, or nowadays, as likely as not, on Zoom with somebody, and pretend like we're just having a conversation, knowing that tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, perhaps millions of people are listening in on you. So do you think that that's the right advice? That actually to be good on TV, you just have to be yourself? Does that hold for everybody, or are there some people who really shouldn't damn be themselves on television? And how do you accomplish being yourself?
So one of the best pieces of advice that I've gotten is nobody gives a shit about you. People don't care about you that much. And if you go out there and flop and it doesn't go well, people will just move on. Nobody's thinking about you that much. Now, for some people, you know, if you're Sam Altman and you go on an interview and you flop, it might get played a lot and it's more consequential because your company's more consequential. But for the vast majority of people, it is just not that big of a deal. I think
Well, that depends on whether you flop or you flop, right? Like if you I think even if you're a no-name person and you have a meltdown on air, right?
Yeah.
You have like 30 seconds of complete blankness in which you suddenly can't speak.
Yeah.
That's going to go viral even if you're nobody, right? And I think that's the fear that people have.
That's an edge case. Yeah, that's an edge case. I think you can sort of control whether you're going to have a screaming meltdown.
Hopefully.
Yeah.
And if you can't, perhaps you shouldn't go on TV.
Not everyone there's the Katie Porter examples that we've been seeing recently. Yeah, but for most people, the range of outcomes is pretty tame. You know, you'll have a maybe mediocre interview where you wanted to say some things and forgot, and just don't stress so much about it. People are a little bit like electrons in that way. Like once you observe them, they change in the process of being observed, and so once the cameras are on, it's nearly impossible to just be our normal natural selves. So like I pre-gamed for this, like I get nervous for these things, even though I know that we're friendly and you're not trying to like secretly destroy me with a gotcha question, I still am a little nervous. I just like walk around and just remind myself that if it doesn't go well, it's not a big deal. So for most people, it does take a lot of practice. You know how people will say the presence of so many fashion models gives us unrealistic expectations about bodies and fitness.
I do think the presence of like, TV professionals gives you
Yes.
unrealistic
So
expectations. That's
many
interesting.
influencers, so many extremely gorgeous and charismatic people on TikTok and with podcasts, and it gives us unrealistic expectations for how we're going to be in front of the camera. And if we try to emulate that, then most of us actually fall into this uncanny valley where we're not ourselves anymore, but we're also not Jake Paul or whatever. And so, what are we actually in? It's this weird in between space that doesn't appeal to people as much as if you had just tried to stay put and stay you.
That's very interesting. Yeah, to go back to the point about excessive media training, I was thinking about that not with Katie Porter, who perhaps could do with a little bit more media training or just with
Yes.
more hiding her true personality, but with
Don't be
uh,
yourself.
sorry.
Don't be yourself, Katie.
Yes, in this particular case, um, but with Abigail Spanberger, I saw clips of her debate with Winsome Sears the other day, and you know, she was in the situation where she knew she was going to be asked about something that's kind of she's just in a bind, right? So the person running as lieutenant governor, who in a sense is running for the position independently, but is obviously kind of on her slate, right? Who is running to be the Democrat lieutenant governor, was discovered to have sent these text messages, which were meant to go to a friend of his, but went to a Republican instead, basically saying that this moderate Republican who had said something positive about a moderate Democrat, deserved to be killed, and his kids deserved to be killed. Those little fascists, or something like
Oh,
that, he
yeah,
said.
right.
And those kids were, 2 and 4 years old, right? And so, you know, how should somebody like Spanberger play this, right? Like, so number one is she thinks that for whatever reasons, she can't distance herself too clearly from that lieutenant governor candidate, either because she thinks that other Democrats are going to be mad at her if she does that, or perhaps because she thinks it's going to be hard for her to govern if she wins the governor's race and she has a Republican lieutenant governor. But that means that she knows this debate is coming up, and in the debate, she's going to be asked about this, right? And so she comes up with this kind of slightly wooden set of talking points that she just keeps sticking to. That is, I don't approve of those messages. Everybody's running as an individual. I think I'm going to be a great governor of Virginia, or something along those lines, right? What would you have advised her? Like, is the key point here just you have to be on the right side of this, and you just have to go into the debate having taken your distance from that candidate? I'm not talking morally now, right? I'm talking just of is the only way to win this comms battle to have a leg you can stand on, and the only way you can have a leg to stand on is to say, I disavow this. I don't want to be governing with him. This is terrible. If not, is there some way to get around this? Because what I think she ended up doing just looks so unnatural and so rehearsed and so media trained that it's just deeply, deeply off-putting.
So first of all, I think that guy sucks. So this isn't sincere advice of trying to help them, but I do think it's useful to use this as a case study. So one important thing for people to remember is if you are trying to if you're trying to do both things at once, it is not that you're pleasing both sides, it is that you're pissing off both sides. That's always the way it goes. If you're trying to make nobody mad, you end up making everybody mad. That's always how it goes. And you're better off picking who's going to be mad at you and for what than trying to make nobody mad at you because, again, everybody will be mad at you. And people are so fed up with these wishy washy, cowardly, half measure things that they see right through it and they're actually looking for it. You saw this with like the initial Cracker Barrel rebrand response. Anytime there's anything from a person or company, people are looking for them to take a stance. Now you can take a stance and have some people be bad. That's better than everybody being mad. So going back to this situation, in this situation, it's not an option to try to give a non-answer. You have to have a view on this. the clearly correct view on this is that it's unacceptable. I don't think there's any world in which you can defend it. However, there's two levels of unacceptable. One is the action was unacceptable, but the action doesn't represent the entire person, and the other merits of the entire person outweigh this, or the action was an aberration. You could try to argue that. The other level is this action does represent the entire person and is illuminating something within them that is unsalvageable. And so opponents would say the latter. This action represents the person and it shows us something deep inside of his soul that is just like spoiled. If she wants to defend him without defending the action, then you would clearly condemn the action and say, I don't stand by this. No one reasonable would stand by this. But I also think that he doesn't stand by this, because what I know of him as a person is bump, bump, bump. And what I believe that he's going to do in office is blah, blah, blah. And therefore, while this thing is completely reprehensible and unacceptable, I believe that he has now tasted what it is like to lash out in a moment of anger, and perhaps he's become more empathetic because of it. You have to square it
Yeah,
down.
why is it? And by the way, I agree with you, but I'm not sure that the candidate is salvageable, and probably both morally and politically, the smartest
I don't
route
think
would
it's
be to
salvageable.
just
Yeah, just
distance herself completely. But
yeah.
why is it that in 3 minutes you've come up, like, if a constraint is for whatever political reason, right? Let's just take it as a hard constraint. You can't completely distance yourself from this candidate, right? Why is it that in 3 minutes you've come up with something that to me seems better politically, but also, frankly, less reprehensible morally than this addiction to not saying anything, right? Like, why is it that a politician can't be trained into going there and saying, look, these text messages are disgusting, they're reprehensible, but look, I know this person, and this is not what we represent. You might even say, look, all of us have said something really off color at some point, right? And it doesn't always represent who we are. This is completely unacceptable what he said, but I know him. I know this does not, in fact, represent who he is. And I think on the policies that matter, he's going to do a better job for Virginia, whatever, right? That seems to me the line you just gave. That's again, it's may not be the right line, but it's a line that somehow you can do. Why is it that instead she is advised to go out there and use this wooden legalistic language that basically avoids and by the way, this is not a single case, right? So in the same debate there was a debate about you know trans girls having access to female changing rooms in Virginia schools and other questions like that. And again, the response was the same kind of non-response response, right? What Abigail Spanberger said on those issues is this is just a decision for local districts and local parents and teachers to make, right? Which just doesn't take any kind of substantial stance on the thing. And as you were saying earlier, I feel like that's going to piss off both sides, because people who think that we absolutely should be fighting for those kind of rights for trans people are going to say you're not actually standing up for them, and most people are going to smell that it's just a way to not own the deeply unpopular position while actually defending the deeply unpopular position. So you may as well take that position, or you can go where the majority of people are,
Yeah.
but you end up in this middle place. And I'm thinking of the congressional hearing of university presidents, in which Claudine Gay of Harvard and the president of Columbia at the time, the president of University of Pennsylvania at the time, I think they're all now out of office, just could not actually defend in a substantial way what the mission of university. So why is it that the advice so often seems to be don't really say anything at all, even though it seems to be quite ineffective?
So there's two types of public figures. One type is their own person, and everybody else has to deal with that and work with that. John Fetterman is an example. Palmer Luckey is an example. They are who they are, and if you want to work with them, you just need to figure out how to work with them, because they're not going to change. You're going to change. Then there are people who are machines that turn consultant advice into public statements. And a lot of politicians are in this category, where they just aggregate consultant advice and then echo that. I think that doesn't speak well of them as people, because if you don't have your own views and if you don't have your own personalities and principles when it comes to these statements, then how are we going to trust you to have your own backbone when it comes to anything else? But there's a lot of people who are like this, and it comes from a place of fear. each of the consultants knows that if they advise something that is safe, they're not going to ever get penalized for missed opportunities. They would only get penalized asymmetrically for mistakes. They only get penalized for mistakes of commission, not omission. And therefore, the best way for them to continue collecting the fees is to avoid mistakes of commission. So if they can just make sure that you don't say something stupid, it doesn't matter if you miss an opportunity, as long as there's no specific error that can be pinned on them. And so what ends up happening is you have the principal agent problem, where they're acting in their own self-interest. They're not trying to find the best possible outcome for you. They're trying to find the outcome that leads to them not being fired. And you go along because you don't have the clarity of moral vision or the strength of principle to override them. And that's when you get these weak public figures.
Yeah, this is something striking to me, particularly in the political ecosystem where, if you run a consultancy, especially on the Democratic side, where I think the kind of thought constraints are stronger, but also on the Republican side, in different ways. And, you lose an election. Plenty of people lose plenty of elections, right? The fact that you advised the losing campaign doesn't stop you from being hired again. If your candidate said something that upset the base, and that went viral on social media in a negative way, even if perhaps it actually increased the chances that candidate had of being elected, then the next candidate might say, I don't know where we can work with you. You're the people who put out that message that a lot of allies hated. Perhaps some of my staff is going to get upset if I hire you. And so the incentive is actually not to make your candidate win. It's to avoid bad publicity, which might hurt your brand as a consultant. And the same, of course, is true. There was reporting that those university presidents had taken extensive advice from law firms, and I think they all took the advice of the same law firm in advance of a congressional hearing. And those, lawyers are risk averse. They're not thinking about how do we maximize the chance of a good outcome. They're thinking how do we minimize the chance that you say something that might somehow be of legal relevance, and then obviously you end up being overtrained into not saying anything at all. I want to go to another case I'm thinking of. I informally advised a minor Democratic presidential candidate in the primaries in 2020, and he was very charismatic in person. I mean, big, booming personality. And you thought, my God, this person, once he gets on the big stage and people see what he's like, he's going to do really great. And then every time the camera turned on, he was terrible.
Oh, interesting.
It
Yeah.
just, his personality kind of just zoom,
Yeah.
went away.
Yeah.
Is that, is that just some people are just super charismatic in person and not on TV? Is that something that you think most people are able to overcome? Is it just there's like one kind of form of charisma that works in a room? There's another form of charisma that works, on a national debate stage. What do you think explains that?
I think there's something innate, which doesn't mean that you can't improve it or work on it, but I do think that people have inherently the mediums that best suit them. And some people are better in a small group, some people are more charismatic in front of a large crowd. Do you ever see somebody who's hugely charismatic talking to a massive rally, but then one on one, they don't seem that engaged? When I
I did a year in theater after college, and there was an actress at the theater I worked at, who, you talked to her in the canteen,
yeah.
and she was pretty, and she was smart actually, but she seemed forgettable. I mean, you would never walk into the canteen and your eyes would never be drawn to her, and then she'd step on stage and she's just magnetic, right? Like in front of 1,000 people, she had something that just like attracted your attention and your fascination in this remarkable way. And when you saw her in private, she was perfectly pleasant and cute, but there was nothing charismatic about her in that context.
People talk about Bill and Hillary Clinton. Oh, can you hear that by the way?
Yes, I can.
Oh, I'm sorry. We're gonna have to edit that out. That was
No worries at all.
weird. Okay. Because I live in rural Pennsylvania, I have a landline.
Yeah, that's very nice and old-fashioned.
Relatively fast. Yeah. take it off the wall. And okay, going back to this, people talk about Bill Clinton and Hillary Clinton. I think that Bill Clinton was more charismatic in front of a large crowd. And I actually think that Hillary Clinton is more charismatic in small groups. When you talk to people who have worked directly with her or interacted with her in a very intimate setting, she can be very charismatic. But in front of this large, in front of a stadium full of people, she's not as charismatic as her husband, who obviously is a once in a generation political talent, but there still is that. The other thing, before we stray too far from this topic of how to give a straight answer and a strong answer without seeming to hedge, I want to just raise the example of Michael Dukakis, 1988 presidential debate. Do you remember this? He was asked on stage about the death penalty, and the question was intense. It was, if your wife Kitty were to be raped and murdered, would you support the death penalty for the person who did that? This has always bothered me so much because I feel like the correct answer, I don't know what he believes, but I feel that the correct answer politically and strategically would have been a layup. So his actual answer was this hem and haw and this very academic response that made him feel like not even a human being. Like
Right.
someone just talked about your wife being raped and murdered, and you're gonna sit back and go through your talking points. It's actually insane. I think a very good answer, assuming this is what he believes, is if someone in my family were subjected to that, and if this crime were committed against someone in my family, I would want to tear the perpetrator limb from limb. I would want to behead them with my bare hands. I would torture them in a chamber for a year. And that is why you shouldn't leave it up to me to decide in that moment out of emotion. That is
Right.
why we need, as a society, to decide in advance the line between punishment and barbarism so that in the moment we're not making decisions like that. Because I will tell you, if someone ever did that and I met them in person, I would commit horrendous crimes against them. That probably
Right.
is how it feels. I don't know. That's how I would feel.
Yeah, and and the thing is that there's always the obvious emotion you feel that somehow in those situations you think you're not allowed to share. Right? That if you want to defend this political position, obviously you can't flip flop, right? Like you're campaigning on not having the death penalty. You can't be like, oh, now that you come up with this hypothetical, let's have a death penalty, right? Like that makes no sense, right? I'm not perhaps not being against the death penalty is not a defensible position, but I think it is, right? And I think actually it's not so clear that in 1988 public opinion was such that you couldn't win an election while opposing the death penalty. But you have to still allow yourself to express that human emotion, right? To say, of course, I would want this person to suffer in the worst possible way. But that's precisely why we need to make rules when we're calm, when we're not the person who's affected, right? So I think that's right, and I think you're right that there's this instinct to because Abigail Spanberger feels like she can't completely distance herself from this other candidate. She feels like she can't express the anger and the disgust over those messages. But in fact, the only way that you can avoid completely distancing yourself from that person is to express the anger and the disgust. And then say, having expressed all of this, here's why I still think they're going to be better for the state of Virginia than the alternative or whatever it is. I want to go to a broader question of what this means for communication today. If we are no longer in this world of one-to-many communication, if we're in a world of many-to-many communication, and we've taken this kind of detour of thinking about how you do well in media and so on, what is the right strategy for a company launching a new product, or for somebody having some important message to communicate? You've talked a lot about the importance of sort of directly communicating with your audience. What does that entail, and why do you think that that's a big part of the answer?
Well, direct can mean a few things, and I mean all of them. So one meaning of direct is to build your own audience and share directly with them, not just through middlemen or through gatekeepers. Another meaning of direct is like you and I having a direct conversation. It's a frank and candid conversation. And that's what people want as well. And that's the advice that Dukakis should have taken before going into this, which is like speak directly without mincing your words and just say what you mean. So people do not have the patience to sit through a bunch of PR slop and corporate pablum to try to figure out what you're actually saying. And then another way of being direct is for the person or the people directly responsible to have the message come from them, from themselves, as opposed to filtered through a bunch of layers. And so again, I mean all of these things. So if you are a founder or a CEO and you're starting something new today, or if you're a political candidate, which is you're the founder of this movement to get you elected, right? You're the chief executive of this vision that you're trying to sell to voters. Number one, you need to have it come directly from you. It doesn't mean that you have to personally star in all of the videos and it has to be a shot of your face, but it has to be your words and your ideas, not the average idea of 17 lawyers and 14 PR people. People can tell. Two is it has to be presented directly and forcefully and without a lot of dancing around. Just get to the point. So even on short videos, for example, people post these videos on X. The drop off after 30 seconds is probably like 90%. I don't remember exact numbers, but it just falls off of a cliff. People's attention doesn't sustain, especially if you haven't earned their continued attention in the first few minutes. So you need to just say it up front as opposed to dancing around and building up to it. And then lastly, history is long. It's never about just this one moment. And politicians would do well to remember this. It's not just about this one election. It's not just about this one statement. There are many, many things in the future. C.S. Lewis, in a different context, said that every small win is a strategic point from which 1,000 more victories can be gained. Something like this. And it's true. It's not just about winning this specific thing. It is about building for the long term. And whether that's building trust or relationship with voters, or if you're a company, building an audience so that you can continue to do this in the future. So what I hate to see is when people create something great and genuinely interesting and they give it away to somebody else to donate engagement to them. So if you're starting a company and you have created something genuinely viral, genuinely engaging, and you were too scared and didn't believe in yourself enough to put it out from you, and you didn't have the confidence that this thing could blow up even if you have a smaller account. Now you have a much bigger account than me, but let's pretend, okay? And I am a big influencer and you're giving it to me and it blows up when I post it. There's a chance that you just donated a bunch of engagement and audience to me for no reason out of fear, right? So I hate to see companies doing this.
So what are some, we've talked about a bunch of examples in politics, and perhaps a little bit outside of politics, of people doing comms badly. What are some examples of people pulling comms off brilliantly? I mean, what are the kind of things that we should emulate?
There are a ton of examples. I just need a second to think of a good one. Given the news of last week, and since I already shouted out Barry in this podcast, I'll use her as an example. There are many things that Barry Weiss has done that are brilliant comms, even though a lot of people are mad at her or don't like her. In fact, I would say that's part of the package. A lot of people think that in order to have good communications and to win people over, they need to be as bland as possible so that nobody gets mad. And what they're doing is they're protecting the downside, but they're capping their upside. So it's like a bit of a higher floor and a tremendously low ceiling. What she has done, which I think is the right way to do it, is to elicit strong feelings within your tribe and get your people to be diehards. And if others are mad about it, it either doesn't matter or it actually helps you. So a lot of the vitriol directed at Barry, and there's a lot, and some of it is anti-Semitic and some of it is just cruel and it's not pleasant. Like if I were her reading through the mentions, I think I would be probably having a mental breakdown. I mean, she's much stronger in that sense than most people. So I'm sure it's not fun. Strategically, for what she's trying to build, it's not the worst thing. You know, it shows what she stands for and what she's not willing to back down from, even in the face of all of this anger. So that's one, is actually taking a stand and being willing to say, you are going to be part of this movement and you are not. We don't see eye to eye, and that's okay.
That's a hard trade-off because it depends, I think, how much you care about the success of your enterprise versus having a pleasant life.
Yeah, that's true.
And I think that Barry is fantastically successful.
Hmm.
I think, you know, having the knowledge that any room you walk into, there's going to be some people who genuinely like and admire you, but also there's going to be some people who are like snarkily texting their friend, being like, "Can you imagine who I'm in a room with right now?" And you know, it has a high cost.
Yeah.
So I think you're right that that is the right strategy, and it's one of the reasons why the free press has been successful. And certainly, there's a basic rule of politics that whatever you're for, some people are going to be against it, and so whenever you embrace a cause, you're building a coalition, but you're also building your anti-coalition. And I think trying to avoid that leads to a form of indeterminateness where perhaps nobody dislikes you, but also nobody's going to like you. Nobody has a reason to trust and follow you, and so on.
Yeah.
But I do think that the personal costs that are involved in that are not trivial, and it actually makes people who are willing to bear those costs, whether you agree with them or not, quite admirable. Because there's this like persistent charge that always gets thrown around about anybody with whom people disagree, of saying, oh, they're a grifter. And I think nearly always that's wrong, because the easy thing, the convenient thing, is not to break with your political tribe, is not to say things that are controversial, is to try and minimize the hate you get online. That is nearly always the easier choice. And to not do that, I think, is rarely, I think it's actually nearly always driven by having genuine beliefs, because the cost of it is significant. And I think most people would rather get along with their friends and be able to go to every dinner party without people asking them critical questions and have, a standard media job and make some amount of money
Hmm.
than be Barry.
And that's why most people won't be great. That's leadership, and it's not for everybody. Being willing to suffer costs that fall disproportionately on you personally for the good of the enterprise so that you can build something enduring that outlasts yourself, that's leadership. And so I'm biased here because Barry's a friend, but I also think even if you are ideologically on the total opposite side of what she's doing, the principle still stands that you have to be willing to say these are not my people in order, through contrast, to say these people are. And that's the movement that I'm going to build. So I think it just requires stepping up and having that courage, because leaders do things all the time that are really crappy for themselves personally. They will see their children less than their employees do. They will get less sleep than their employees do. They will get more death threats than their employees do. Like, all of these things are part of being the tip of the spear for the movement that you're trying to build. So I think absolutely, it sucks to be the person facing that, but also somebody's got to do it. And there is no movement without a leader of the movement who's willing to bear that.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Um, I didn't anticipate talking as much about politics as I am, but I guess it is the realm I'm most fluent in. I'm struck by the fact that the masters of communication that you think of have really changed over time. You mentioned Bill Clinton earlier as a consummate communicator. Tony Blair in Britain was similar, but their skill was certainly to come across as reasonably authentic and to come across like they
Yeah.
incarnated at the time something in a cultural mood. But the core skill was to win a news cycle, right? Mostly people watch news at 7 or 8 p.m. on the main television channels. And you want to make sure that you or stand in for you had the right soundbite during those news, because people would be half paying attention, and the right 10-word line that really framed the political issue of a day would make people think, all right, these people are getting it and the opponents are not getting it. And of course, in a sense, I think when you look at the campaign of someone like Kamala Harris, they still were trying to operate in a somewhat similar world, right? Avoid negatives, avoid controversy, have the right kind of soundbite. I mean, Kamala Harris for the people or whatever, right? Like that's a kind of throwback 90s style soundbite. And then you have Donald Trump, right? Who never listens to anybody around him about what the soundbite is, so far as I can tell, doesn't feel like it, right? Who often says stuff that gets him into all kinds of trouble and that alienates people, but is always himself in a different way, right? And so Kamala Harris ends up, and I think there's some more details about exactly the Joe Rogan booking, and perhaps the story was a little bit more complicated than it seemed at the beginning. But the fundamental truth of it is that Kamala Harris would not have been very good in Joe Rogan, because she wouldn't have been able to be her authentic self for 2 or 3 hours, right? Whereas Donald Trump went on Joe Rogan, and it was very effective because whatever you think of Trump, and I see him very negatively, he is capable of being there and actually being himself and chewing the shit for 3 hours and talking about whatever Joe Rogan throws at him. So what does it mean, I guess, to go direct in politics? I'm going to use a very different example, somebody who I also have some reservations about, Zoran Mamdani. He seems to have gone direct in all kinds of ways, perhaps out of necessity, because at the beginning nobody was paying attention to him, and he was a minor assemblyman, and he really wasn't meant to win the nomination. And so sometimes your lack of assets, your lack of access to the New York Times editorial board, your lack of big donor dollars to run incessant ads that are very slick on New York One can also end up being a strength, right? But he, in a sense, seems to have gone direct to consumer as well.
Honestly, Mamdani is crushing it from a comms perspective. Like, the way to think about comms, and you alluded to this earlier, is not how well or how poorly is it going, because there's so many other factors. It is how much better is it going than it should be, based on the merit, right? You launch a book, and the book is an A minus, and the book tour and the book reception are an A plus. That alpha comes from probably comms, right? Or
Right.
sometimes you see companies or products that are actually really excellent, but nobody's talking about them. That is negative alpha added by comms. And so in this case, on the merits, Mamdani, in my opinion, is really not very compelling. You could say stronger negative things, but at the very least, he's not that compelling if you just look at his background on paper. But through incredible comms, and I count personal charisma as being part of that, he has vaulted himself to a preeminent position in the race. So he and his team are just absolutely crushing it. Sometimes in comms, necessity is the mother of invention. And so when you don't have the means to go to the traditional outlets, or when you don't have the resources to do to the traditional things, sometimes it also forces creativity, and wonderful things can come from that. The way that I learned comms was by working with a lot of people that today are celebrated, but at the time were considered total thought criminals. Our friends at Substack and Anduril, and people that at the time were considered nearly unacceptable in polite company. People come around now and they're all on the bandwagon, but we didn't have the option to just call up the New York Times and get a friendly article. That wasn't on the table. You sort of have to.
In part because Substack actually is and was a competitor to the New York Times, and quite a successful competitor to the New York Times.
I think now we're seeing that, for example, the free press growing out of Substack. I think we've seen that it's very formidable, but there were definitely ideological factors at play as well. So I think sometimes being forced to innovate can be very good for you. I think that Mamdani's campaign has both the creativity and the drive and really good instincts, as well as probably being forced to innovate because they don't control a lot of the traditional power centers of New York like the incumbents do.
One thing I'm struck by in the United States, but elsewhere as well, is, we talked about Mamdani, who's a democratic socialist. We talked about Trump, who's Trump. And then we talked about people like Abigail Spanberger, or the presidents of various Ivy League universities. And they're the ones who are struggling. You look at the media game in Europe of more moderate parties on the center-left or the center-right. They're failing abysmally. And you talk at the more extreme movements, and they're doing very, very well. Why is it that moderates are particularly struggling in politics in this political moment? And is it possible to be charismatic, to be outspoken, to be somebody who doesn't look like the humming and hawing and always saying on the one hand, on the other hand, and I'm going to avoid taking a clear stance while defending those moderate positions? If moderate political parties and movements, whether on the center-left and center-right, want to learn something from your playbook, what is it that they should do?
So first of all, it's easier to get people excited about one thing than about 10 things. 10 things is not 10 times as powerful as one thing. It's probably 1/10 as powerful as one thing. And when you are a moderate, it's very hard to have one big spike in your campaign. The other thing is, yeah, most Americans are probably between the 40s politically, but it's hard to have a rallying cry for that because it feels like you said, it's such a compromised position. So I have a couple thoughts on this actually. One way to make moderation seem more interesting is to find something that actually sounds a little bit radical. To take it and frame it and make it sound like a more pointed position to take. The other way is to exist in contrast to a foil where you are fighting against some kind of radical takeover. A lot of the Trump campaign was actually fighting against radicals in terms of how it was framed, and trying to save America from these extremists, according to their campaign. And so that's another way to do it as well. I think that moderates actually we all need them to get more creative and to get more interesting. And we're not going to get there through the average opinions of 45 consultants. We're just going to need somebody who's able to be an interesting person and be an interesting messenger, so that if people initially aren't drawn to the message of moderation, they're at least drawn to the person, and then the person becomes a gateway drug for the platform.
Give me an example of sort of, and I know that you're not a political consultant, so I'm kind of pushing you into something that's really not your job. But give me an example of, how do you choose an issue like that, or how do you make something sound radical that's coming from an ideologically moderate position? And part of the problem here, of course, is that I'm a philosophical liberal at the most fundamental level, right? I think that basic values like individual rights and the freedom of speech and so on are what has allowed our societies to become affluent and peaceable. And despite all of the shortcomings of our society, that makes them a lot better than any other damn society in the history of humanity. But of course, I also recognize that we fail to live up to those principles in some ways. And so you end up being in this kind of difficult position where you want to say, there's lots of things I'm angry about in America today, lots of things that I think don't work very well, lots of things that don't accord to my ideals, and I want to fight to change that. But also, I think there's things that we need to defend, and that some of the irresponsible people who say just tear everything down might lead us to a state of affairs that is infinitely worse. And that's not hard to imagine, because lots of parts of the world are infinitely worse today, and most parts of the world have been infinitely worse in the past. And so I think there's always this, you always feel cross-pressured between defending the status quo and promising that you're going to change and improve the status quo. Is there a way of being clear about this that's not too intellectual, too complicated? I think I can be clear about this to an intellectual audience, but I'm not sure that I would be able to be clear about this to an electoral audience. I have no political ambitions, but those are different things. I think my podcast listeners understand what I'm about and what I'm trying to say. If I had to put this into words that, would work on a presidential debate stage, I think that is much, much, much harder. And that's why, it's not that like all these moderates are dummies. It's not like all of them are idiots. I think that's the most fundamental reason why they're failing, not just in the United States, but in all of these other countries as well.
So let's take a position that is as boring and unpopular as possible. Like individual responsibility. and let's say that we need to bring back individual responsibility, and people need to take their fate into their own hands to some degree. Even as I'm saying it, it sounds pretty blah. So you'll see like a dip in listenership on your podcast. So boring. One way would be to say it in the most direct terms possible, which is like, suck it up, right? There are many ways to say things. One way would be to say, well, it's time to put individual responsibility back into the... Another way is just like, you need to suck it up and I need to suck it up. For too long, we've been babies about these very things that actually we have the power to change. Stop whining, stop crying about it, let's just do it. I'm going to do the same.
Margaret Thatcher said, get on your bike. right? Like there's no more jobs in your town. Get on your bike. Now, as you were saying earlier, that polarized, right? There's people who hated that message, but there's a lot of people who liked that message, and she was very politically effective.
Yeah, but as opposed to everybody feeling neutral about that message, a consequence of which is that they'll never choose you over somebody else because neutral doesn't get you to the polls. You now have people who are going to argue with you about it, and that's a good thing. And you also have people who agree with you very strongly, which is a good thing as well. Margaret Thatcher's the GOAT, by the way, so if she did this, it probably is already the right answer. But then the other thing you can do is you can create a little bit of a Nixon and China effect with yourself. It's very it doesn't always land well to criticize other people or to blame other people, but using yourself as an example is easy to do, and it just comes across as humility, which is kind of rare in politicians. So you could say, these are times in my life when I have failed to step up, and these are the alternate paths that could have happened for me. And by the way, the people who most need to step up are young men, and I am a young man, and I've seen this in my life. I'm challenging you to do this in yours. You can disagree with Jordan Peterson on everything, but it's hard to argue that he has created a very powerful movement and following. Same with Charlie Kirk. People who don't even like him at all have to concede that he created an incredibly powerful movement of young people by relating himself to them. This is something that you can do as a politician as well. I think that it's hard to take something that is -10 interesting and make it +10 interesting every time, but it's not as hard as people make it look. I think that with some effort and creativity, everything could be more interesting than it is today. And step one is actually just using normal words that you would use in a conversation.
Well, one thing I've learned today, Lulu, is that it's very important to be authentic. And in that spirit, I just want to say that my producer just texted me that it wasn't Margaret Thatcher, it was Norman Tebbit, one of her ministers, who said, get on your bike. But the rest of that point was correct.
Great. Sure, a wonderful person as well. The real you're brutal.
Lulu, thank you so much for your insights. Thank you so much for the work you do. And perhaps we have to have you back on around election time to analyze the political comms of some primary contenders in 2028 or something like that.
I'm sure everything will go smoothly and nothing chaotic or crazy at all to discuss. Thank you, Yascha.
It's smooth sailing until 2028.
Well, appreciate your time.